This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation about technology, philosophy, and a classic beloved motorcycle journey with Mark Richardson, author of Zen and Now, On the Trail of Robert Pirsig, and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Mark Richardson is the editor of the Wheels section of the Toronto Star. In his new book, Zen and Now, he retraces the American motorcycle journey made famous in the beloved non-fiction novel, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, almost 40 years later. Mark, welcome to the program.
Hey, thank you for having me. And you know, that's a great description, a non-fiction novel. I've not heard it before, but it fits the book so well.
I actually just made that up a few minutes ago. I was thinking...
Well, I think that you should be famous for that.
I was thinking, what am I going to call this book? Because I've read the book. I, too, enjoy the book. So many people do. But it's not, as you know, it's not entirely true, but so much of it is. What's the ratio, do you think?
It depends. Some of the big things are true, and some of the big things certainly aren't true. And then there are lots of little liberties taken along the way. The author, Robert Pirsig, has never actually come out and said, apart from a couple of little exceptions, just what was and was not true in his book. A lot of people, and I would hazard a guess at 50-50, a lot of people assume it to be entirely true because it's written as if it is a truthful account of a trip across America from Minneapolis to San Francisco. And it took about 2.5 weeks or so at the time, and he traveled with his son, who was 11 years old, on a motorcycle. But, you know, the narrator is what they call in literary things an unreliable narrator. And you don't necessarily pick up on this until you're halfway through the book, that, you know, this may not be exactly as it seems, because you're being told it as fact by somebody who you can't trust.
For people who haven't read the book and are listening, it's going to be, I don't know if difficult is the word, but it's going to be a challenge to describe exactly what it is, because people take it as different things, as a novel, like we've said, or as a nonfiction work, or as a philosophical treatise, although I'm not sure that that's entirely correct to call it that. How do you approach it? How have you approached it? How did you approach it at first, I guess? What's the start of your relationship with Pirsig's book?
Well, I first read a book back when I was a teenager, which I guess was about the late 70s or so. And I only read it because I literally found it on my aunt's bookshelf. And it had a motorcycle in the title and the picture of one on the cover. And I thought, ooh, motorcycles, I like motorcycles. So I started to read it and discovered fairly rapidly, a dozen or so pages in, that it really wasn't about motorcycles. I started again about 10 years later. I was studying philosophy and not really doing very well at it, but trying. It was Philosophy 101, 102. And this was an excuse to maybe try and combine some philosophical study with motorcycles. I was taking the easy way out, you see. So I started reading the book, and I probably got about halfway through because I was trying to absorb every single sentence. But, you know, I just ran out of time at the end of the semester. I never finished it then. It wasn't until I got to pretty much 41 years old. I was in my 40s anyway, and I was going on vacation, and I had some time to read a book on vacation. It was with the family. I had 2 small boys and a wife. We went off to a cottage beside a lake, and I saw this book sitting on a shelf. I thought, you know what, you really should read this because everybody says it's a classic, and I have no idea why. So I took this book, and I sat and I read this book. When it got pretty heavy with philosophical discourse, I sort of skipped over that bit, moved on to the next bit, and got all the way to the end. But, you know, when I got to the end, the final page, I thought, now I get it. This is a good book. And I literally didn't put it down. I turned right to the first page again, and I read it all the way through, taking in every single word. And I guess it clicked for me then because I had a wife and a small kids in my family that were a great pressure on my time, as they were on her time, everybody's time. And I was feeling some of the onslaught of societal pressure, the pressure of technology these days, all of that stuff, which Robert Pirsig discusses so eloquently in his book. I mean, his book is trying to find a balance between the onslaught of technology and the pleasures of art and culture and that. It's sort of a balance between science and art, between East and West, that sort of thing, yin and yang, if you wish. And I was looking for that balance at that time. I hadn't been before, but I certainly was then. I think that's why I appreciated it then.
This book has been such a hit since its release. There's millions and millions of copies floating around out there, and not all of those readers could be the type to enjoy philosophical treatises, and not all of them have families and can identify with that element. So what do you chalk up the scale of the success to? There seems to be some element that's tough to identify that explains this, but I don't know what it is.
Well, it was an unexpected hit when it was published in 1974. Nobody really thought that it was going to be as popular as it was. In fact, it's a well-known fact that more than 100 publishing houses had turned it down, had rejected the idea of the manuscript from Robert Pirsig when he proposed it. But in 74, I think that the States, North America even, was starting to feel a little overwhelmed with all the various technologies that were coming at you. You had cars and vehicles. You had air travel that was around. You had the very beginnings of computers. You had telephones where you didn't necessarily need a party line. This sort of thing. Technology was starting to hit people, and they didn't know what to do with it. And, of course, it's an easy thing to blame technology for all your problems, right? Your computer doesn't work. You slam the mouse down and you say, stupid computer, but it's probably not your computer. It's probably just you and your attitude to it. The thing is that I think it hit a button with an America that was questioning itself back in 1974, but now, in 2008, it's an even bigger button. It's a massive button. I mean, we've got 500 channels and still nothing on them. Back then, they just had 3 networks. We've got the Internet. We've got email. We've got everything. Cell phones, BlackBerries, you name it. People, I think, now are still reading Zen and the Art, even though it's kind of a dated book in its way, because its message doesn't go away.
Do you know if Zen and the Art is purely an American classic, or is there a wide world readership? Because I know you met people, or you talked with people, you discussed the book with people who are outside the U.S. and became what they call Pirsig's pilgrims. I suppose you can explain what those are as well.
It is really a very North American book. That said, I mean, it describes a road trip between Minneapolis and San Francisco on a motorcycle. But that said, it's been translated into 27 different languages. That's a lot of languages. It's sold around the world. And many of the people who adore this book come from those other countries. There seems to be a particular clique within Germany and Scandinavia and Northern Europe. But, you know, people are from all over. It's not just an American issue. But, you know what, the term Pirsig's Pilgrims is something that was coined a few years ago by a woman named Jenny DeWeese. Robert and Chris Pirsig had stayed with Jenny DeWeese as part of his book. She lived in Bozeman, Montana, and they spent a few days staying with her during the trip that's described in the book. And then afterwards, other people just turned up on her doorstep once it was published and said, hello, are you Jenny DeWeese? We're following the trip that Robert Pirsig took, and we thought we might say hello. This was completely unexpected to anybody. And Jenny came up with the term of Pirsig's Pilgrims just because it seemed to fit. But, you know, I don't really like that term because it's kind of a religious term. Well, it is a religious term. And Robert Pirsig has been considered a guru by many, but by some he's considered almost a deity for his views. And frankly, it's got him running scared. That's one reason why he is so reclusive. He doesn't like to admit to where he lives. He doesn't really hide, but he certainly doesn't go out and advertise himself any more than he has to. And I think that's because people do consider him to be almost a deity. And, well, the man has stalkers, some of whom are as he used to be, which is mentally unwell. He was a schizophrenic.
Why Pirsig, what do you think they want from the man himself? You followed his path, but you weren't chasing him. What separates you from them?
I thought his book was a good book. I enjoyed it and I appreciated it, but I wasn't one of those people who thought, wow, that's a really fabulous book. I must be able to quote it like I can quote a Bible. Some people are like that. Some people need to know the exact route that Robert Pirsig took in order to best follow his path and be more like him and find that wonderful balance. I looked for that exact route, I admit, in order to try and just see what was there, to be honest with you. But the irony is, of course, and I didn't know this until, frankly, I had come back from my trip, and I started researching Robert Pirsig, and we corresponded a few times. But Robert Pirsig's life itself was not that life of balance and wonderment that many people would assume it to be. It's even in his description of his relationship with his son Chris in Zen and Now is not a happy description, and it's pure irony that such a strong message should come out of such a bizarre relationship.
Reading your book, I thought to myself, I would go to great lengths to avoid living the life of Robert Pirsig.
You know, his entire family went through fiery turmoils, is the best thing I can think of, the best way to put it. It was a troubled family. There was Robert Pirsig, there was his wife, Nancy, his son, Chris, who went with him on the motorcycle, and his other son, Ted. Nancy and Ted they may not even ever be mentioned. They're certainly not named in his book. They're not a part of it. This is between Robert Pirsig and Chris. But between them, they had all kinds of problems. Pirsig was schizophrenic. He literally drove himself nuts. He was committed to a hospital for the insane, after popping sleeping pills and drinking and being generally being schizophrenic. He stood over his wife with a gun at one point, threatening to kill her while his children cowered in a bedroom alongside, and that's what finally drove them all over the edge and what forced him to be committed. His sons started exhibiting this same sort of behavior, especially Chris, and both of them ended up heavily into drugs and in trouble with the law, which is ironic because their grandfather was actually a famous lawyer in Minnesota who specialized in juvenile law. And Nancy and her children were very much left alone by Robert Pirsig to deal with themselves while he agonized over the metaphysical and was an academic who would spend hours staring at the wall thinking, considering for himself what the meaning of quality really was. Wasn't a terribly practical guy in that respect. But I felt quite comfortable with writing their story, which I'd had no idea existed. I didn't know this, and none of it was publicized until I started chipping away at it and then found family members and friends and started talking to them. Because ultimately everybody came out of it okay, with the obvious exception of Chris, who was murdered in San Francisco. But Robert Pirsig divorced his wife after what should have been the great success of his book, which allowed him to buy a boat and head off around the world and everything, but what should have been an idyllic writer's existence was not. They separated, but Pirsig remarried and is happy, has a daughter and a granddaughter and is happy. Nancy remarried and is happy. Ted has also found comfort living in Hawaii. So there is a resolution to the whole story. If there had not been such a resolution, I'm not sure I could have pursued this.
Tell me if you've gotten the same vibe from Zen and Now, but while reading it myself, I've read it a few times. I would find myself thinking during certain moments of the book, and these are not just the ones that directly reference his schizophrenia, but I'd feel like I was reading, in certain ways, the work of a madman, but in the same way that, say, Lord of the Rings is the work of a madman. There's a certain obsession there. I compare it to your book, which is written by a sane man, so you have a good book written by a sane man, a good book written by a less than sane man. Did you get the same vibe while reading Zen and Now, that there was just that element that wasn't quite in our own reality. I don't quite know how else to put that.
Yeah, that always sort of skirts along the edge of reality. As you get that vibe, you sort of start to question, well, hang on a second. Because when you first read a book, you assume that the person writing it is, perfectly sane and normal, a lot like you. Maybe has an interesting story to tell. But as you get into it, and especially if you've read it previously or tried to read it so you have a context to it, as you get into it, you recognize that, you know what, not everything is as it seems here. And this is an unreliable narrator. This is somebody who you can't necessarily trust to be telling you what's actually going on. And there's certain little clues there. The narrator at one point says that, he hasn't had a new idea in years. At another point, he says that he's a heretic who's recanted. Little direct hints there that, oh, hang on, I got to stop and just consider what he's saying, but take it with a pinch of salt. But you see, he is an insane man. Robert Pirsig himself, this is part of the complication of the book for many people, when they don't have this context in which to place it. Robert Pirsig was relatively normal when he wrote his book it took him from 1968 until 1974 to finish the book. He was relatively normal when he did this, but he wrote it as two people. He had been a schizophrenic, and his personality, when he, up until 30 years old or so, 31, was forcibly removed from him in that hospital for the insane through shock treatment. Then he was released from the hospital, and he came out as what's supposed to be a stable person. So the Robert Pirsig who wrote the book was as normal as somebody can be for this. However, the narrator of the book that Robert Pirsig is writing as is the person after shock treatment who is wrestling in himself with the fact that he has this other personality, whom he calls Phaedrus, which is the personality from before shock treatment. And the book itself is a tussle between the two personalities of supposedly Robert Pirsig for the ownership of their son, Chris, and for a resolution in themselves. You don't get this at the beginning. You assume that the narrator is a good guy, and he describes Phaedrus, the former personality, as like a bad, threatening guy. But in fact, you come to realize, if you read the book as you should, that Phaedrus is not a bad guy at all, and in fact the narrator is the bad person here. And Chris is stuck in the middle between the two. As I say, it's kind of complicated.
For those who haven't read the book, I suppose we should make it perfectly clear what the structure of the book is here. It starts out as what really reads as a typical, normal American road novel, but then it transitions, I don't know if you'd call it smoothly or abruptly, but transitions into a bit of an essayistic sort of thing on technology, the nature of education, schizophrenia, electroshock treatment. How well do you think that transition works?
I think it works very well. I mean, Pirsig says right up front, he says two things right up front. The first thing he says is, this book is not really very much about motorcycles or Zen. It's about something else. And which took a lot of people by surprise, even so, when they saw the title and tried to read it, including myself back as a teenager. The second thing he does, right from page 4, I can't remember, right at the very, very beginning, is he says, look, as we go along this road from Minneapolis to San Francisco, and he's talking to the reader at this point, as the narrator of the book, he says, I'm going to give you what I call chautauquas, right, which are like the traveling road shows of the first part of the century, the last part of the 19th century, in which these are lectures that were given, popular lectures and discourses on subjects that were given to members of the public just by people turning up in towns. And he's saying, I'm going to give you these chautauquas, these lectures, as we travel along, because there's some things I want to get off my chest. And he does that. We ride along for a little while, and then he says, oh, this reminds me of this. And then he launches into what he calls a chautauqua, which is actually him saying, look, this is the state of of society right now. This is my take on it. This is why I think that it's maybe not quite right and what we need to do about it.
Now take us from the point to where you're reading this book, you're reading Pirsig's journey, to where you're actually saying to yourself, I'm going to make Pirsig's journey.
I finished reading this book, as I mentioned, I think, on my 41st birthday, lying in that hammock beside the lake. And I thought, that was a good road trip. It's very similar as a road trip to the road trip that I had made some 19 years previously on my motorcycle, on my Suzuki dirt bike, when I was just a bum. I had quit my job and I wanted to go off and explore the world, certainly explore North America. And I spent a year wandering around on my motorcycle. I got to the end of Robert Pirsig's book. I thought, all those things have clicked on with me, and this is a good book. I thought, I really need to get away for a while. It's a very selfish thing, but I'm sorry, I just felt that way. And I discussed it all with my wife, and we worked out a way that this could be done. She went on vacation to her sisters. She's got a farm in Europe, and she went on vacation to go stay with her with our two boys, leaving me to go off on my motorcycle and, well, as she put it, find yourself and sort yourself out a bit. It was a midlife crisis, right, for me, I guess. I didn't really see that at the time, but I've seen it since. But I took off, or I planned to take off and do this. But then I was thinking this as I read it again that second time, having turned back to the front of the book and gone through it. And in doing this, I thought, if I follow this trip, this road trip, exactly, then maybe two things will happen. Maybe some of Robert Pirsig's lessons of quality will become more obvious, more transparent to me, and my life will get better for it. And secondly, hey, if I do a proper follow-up of this thing, maybe there's even a book to be written here. I didn't take off to do this to write a book. I hoped that I might have a book in me because I'd never written a book before, but I thought it might happen. So I took lots of notes and took lots of pictures and stuff, but I didn't decide that, yes, there was a book until I had come back home again.
What are the challenges of actually figuring out Pirsig's route, figuring out what turns specifically you're going to have to take? Because Pirsig is descriptive in Zen and Now, very descriptive, but he's not a roadmap by any means.
Oh, no, that's right. Today, there's very little challenge in it because enough of the route is known. And you can go onto the Internet and you can figure out pretty much exactly where all the turns were. Robert Pirsig has been asked over the years to try and clarify the route, and he has given a couple of ideas for where it would have taken him. Because yes, you're right. In his book, he'll say something like, "We stopped off at this town in Miles City, Montana," and you know that you're supposed to be there, and you know that it's a Thursday when that happens. But you don't necessarily know which hotel he stayed in, or there's been great debate about that. Or you don't know exactly how he got there. But most of the time, you know that he took the secondary highways. You know that he got to this point just in time and that point at this time. So you could figure out what the route was. I think that I figured out the route pretty much almost exactly, sometimes by just extrapolation. Well, if he reached here, then 2 hours before he must have been here, so this is where they must have had breakfast, that sort of thing. But nowadays, you can go online and find the exact route. But you know what? Pirsig and I don't blame him for this, he gets really fed up with it. Somebody, I saw a copy of the letter. They had written to him and said, well, did you turn left just before that signpost, or did you turn left after the signpost? And as he said, geez, if I'd known that 40 years later somebody was going to ask me a question like that, I'd have made notes. But I didn't. It's just not important. It doesn't matter. It's not the route itself. It's the bigger picture that you should be getting at.
So for all those who have read the book and who have pondered making the journey themselves but never will, what did it feel like when you started seeing things described in the book and you knew you were seeing the same things, doing the same things, looking at the same things that Pirsig did? You knew for sure.
Well, it's kind of eerie to see them, I must admit, because the Pirsig journey was in 1968, and the route that he takes from Minneapolis to San Francisco is mostly on, well, it almost always is on the road less traveled. He didn't go through tourist areas. He avoided them, in fact. He took some nice, interesting, pretty roads, but he didn't go through big built-up areas. And so because of this, much of what he went through is almost exactly as it was back in 1968, today, 40 years later. And it was, well, for me, it was kind of freaky and sometimes because I also went at around the same time of the year. I was about 2 weeks later than he was. It's generally accepted that they set off on their trip at around July the 8th or the 9th. And I went, I think I left on the 18th of July. But, you know, he'd say, we came over the pass and we saw these sort of buttes on the left and trees on the right, and it just began to rain. And then I would come over the pass and I'd see the buttes on the left and the trees on the right, and it would start to rain. There was a lot of coincidence going on with this trip for me, and I'm not sure I really believe in coincidence so much anymore.
How much did the built environment change, or so you could tell from comparing the text to the actual built environment? Because I think of a city like, for example, Toronto. You look at 1968 versus the early 2000s, and it's not going to look very similar. What did the cities look like in comparison to the book?
He leaves Minneapolis, or St. Paul, in fact, he lived in, and the story starts on the road outside of Minneapolis. Though, I mean, I tried to follow it. I figured it out. Well, they went with their friends, the Sutherlands, so they'd have gone from their house, and then they would have, you know, they'd have left the Pirsig house and then gone to the Sutherlands' house, and then what route would he have taken out of there? There's a reference in his second book, Lila, to meeting Robert Redford and saying that Lake Minnetonka was part of the Zen route. So I made a point of going through past Lake Minnetonka and up. But the towns themselves, though, you're quite right that they have changed. There were very few nice diners to be able to stop and have breakfast. All there was Burger Kings and McDonald's. The roads themselves, when they were especially twisty, were often straightened out. There's one area at White Bird, Idaho, that's right, which was an amazingly twisting road, which you can see from the new road. They followed this road, it twisted so many times, I think it would have made 17 complete circles or 30 complete circles, something like that, as it wound down the pass. And you can see it from the straight road that I followed down, which has been built since. And you know what? I mean, sometimes that straight road isn't such a bad thing after all. Sometimes it is safer, but it's often a little less interesting. Well, I'll give you an example. I met a woman in Dayville, Oregon. She had campaigned to have the trees, the gorgeous trees outside her house, left intact when they put in the new road. But she lost the battle, and the silver maple was knocked down, her prized silver maple from outside her home. It was uprooted and removed. But they found, in fact, that it was diseased and damaged, and it wouldn't have lasted long anyway. It would probably have fallen on her house soon enough. As she said, you know, sometimes we don't know what's in our hearts, and we just have to accept progress. But there again, progress only to a certain extent.
In your mind, how adherent did you think you would have to be to not just Pirsig's route, but Pirsig's actions?
I wasn't adherent to Pirsig's actions at all. Pirsig was traveling with his friends for the first half of the trip, and he was traveling with his son throughout the trip, and I was traveling alone. So I didn't have to do any of that. I also understood that half of, well, you know, you asked me how much, and I'd have to say half. Half of what Pirsig says happened didn't really happen exactly as he put it. So although the trip itself was exact and a very physical thing, the emotional side of the trip often was fabricated to suit his literary purpose. So I didn't worry myself too much about that. But certainly for the first half or even three-quarters of the trip, I tried to adhere as absolute best I could to the exact route because I felt that I ought to. You know, why not? It looked pretty good down this road, as good as that road, so why not take this road? But then in the last several days, I really wanted to get away from the route. I wanted to just break away from the Pirsigs. They were getting pretty dreary and morose and self-absorbed in the book itself in the last several days as they built up to the big climax in California. And I couldn't help but have some of that rub off on me, and just want to say, look, I'm not going to bother staying where they stayed tonight. I'm not going to bother taking that circuitous route around. I'm going to just go a more direct route because I'm getting a bit tired now. But for one reason or another, as I lay out in my book, I always ended up taking the exact same route right through to the very, very end, or right through at least until the climax scene at Point Cabrillo.
You even missed the turnoff sign early in the beginning, deliberately, as I recall, and then turn around to make the same loop they did. You repeated even the mistake.
Well, I had intended to miss the turnoff sign because that's what you're supposed to do, I suppose, if you're a Pirsig pilgrim. Pirsig missed the turnoff sign, so I had intended to miss it. And it's described as being as big as a barn door. And this is the direct route through to North Dakota. But, as you say, Colin, I really did miss it. I was looking the other way when I went past it. And I'm thinking, hang on a second, there should be a sign around here that I'm supposed to miss. Where is this? And I backed up, and yeah, there it had been. And it was big as a barn door.
What kind of difference did it make that you went alone, whereas Pirsig started out with his son, of course, Chris, and the Sutherlands, and then it just became him and Chris, but he was still with somebody. And you took the journey solo. What difference do you think that ultimately made as far as you getting a similar experience to Pirsig?
Well, the good part of it is that some of this journey can be fairly arduous, especially on a motorcycle, and especially on a motorcycle like this one that I was riding, and I'm riding at the moment. It's air-cooled, it's kick-started, it's not terribly comfortable. But for me, I didn't have to worry about the responsibility of that, of feeling bad because my son is on the back and being uncomfortable. For Pirsig, yes, he traveled with his friends, but he often found his friends to be a frustration at the beginning, the first half of his trip. His friends certainly found him to be even more of a frustration. He was going more slowly and more carefully on his older, less sophisticated motorcycle than they were. And as for his relationship with Chris at the time, in the book, at any rate, the narrator is barely even aware that Chris is there. And he just wants to send him home on a bus toward the end of the journey. In real life, I don't think that was quite so bad. I don't think that Robert Pirsig himself is quite such an awful father. In Zen and the Art, Chris is always crying and always upset, and there's something going on here. And you find out fairly soon that Chris is wrestling his own demons here. Chris misses his father from before. He doesn't like this bad narrator who's telling the story in the book. But in real life, Chris actually had a pretty good trip. And that was one of his problems with the book after it was published, that he was saddled with this reputation as a whining, whinging, crying kid, when in fact he was pretty much up for anything and had a good trip.
As for the bikes themselves, how does your bike, Jackie New, the new Jackie Blue, differ from the Super Hawk that Pirsig rode originally in '68?
Well, in some ways she's very different. I mean, Pirsig's bike was a road bike and Honda and designed for, not really designed for long distance travel, but my bike is what's called a dual purpose bike, and twice the size at 600 cc's. But there again, my bike, I think, is pretty much the same sort of bike as Pirsig had, in that it's not really designed for cross-country travel. She's not terribly comfortable. My bike is now, she's 20-something years old. She's essentially the same motorcycle that I had taken on this trip of my own 20 years previously when I was a bum around North America. The reason I chose her, and with my job, I could actually have pretty much driven any car I wanted or any motorcycle I wanted taken on this trip. But I chose this motorcycle just because she's really simple. She's just an engine, a single-cylinder engine at that, with a carburetor, pair of wheels, headlamp, tail light, seat in the middle. She's air-cooled. She doesn't even have an electric start. She's about as simple as you can be. And I wanted the simplest form of motorized transport that I could find to take on this relatively adventurous trip, because I figured that if I could do that, on this motorcycle, then I could pretty much do anything. And as I say, I wanted a motorized thing. My wife is big into bicycles. She'd have liked me to have taken a bicycle, but I didn't want to be distracted by the fact that I was exhausted all the time.
Now, despite simplicity, it's tough to get through a trip that crosses so much of the country on a motorcycle without running into mechanical problems. And mechanics and technology and the human attitude toward them is so central to Pirsig's book and to your book as well. How do the technical problems that cropped up and how they were handled compare between your journey and Pirsig's?
Pirsig didn't really have very many technical problems. It was mostly maintenance. And this is part of the vehicle for being able to write about motorcycle maintenance. And he used the maintenance of his bike and the descriptions of how he maintained his bike to drum home his point about how if a job is worth doing, it's worth doing well. He had had lots of problems with mechanics working on his motorcycle and messing the whole thing up, literally punching holes in the engine and all of this stuff. And he preferred to do the job himself and to do it properly the way it should be done and take some time over it. It was the same for me that my issues were mostly maintenance, although the bike did keep breaking somewhat. I mean, I was very concerned that the brakes were going to not last me all the way to California. I was concerned that the clutch was going to give out riding over the mountains. I was especially concerned once the shock absorber basically collapsed with another 1,000 miles or so to go. All the fluid leaked out of her and could not be easily fixed. She needed basic maintenance, though, to get her from the beginning to the end. And I also used the description of my motorcycle's maintenance to try to drum home some of Pirsig's points about how it's done and how you need to do it carefully. I mean, we've had a lot of similarities in this. You mentioned that you were asking about the similarities between his bike and my bike. His motorcycle once gave out completely for the sake of a 25-cent pin that he found dislodged in the engine. It was blocking the oil, and it kept overheating the flow of oil. It kept overheating the engine and seizing it up. I had the same thing. I had a 25-cent pin, literally, that held together my drive chain. It fell off on the highway at speed, not on this trip, but just previously. And the entire bike suddenly became completely vulnerable to all of the 5 lanes of traffic and everything else. We were put in the same situation thanks to a 25-cent pin. There were so many similarities and coincidences, it was quite spooky.
How difficult is it, or maybe it's not as difficult as I imagined, to adopt the same attitude Pirsig had toward technology, the same equanimity, the same, I don't know if even-handedness is the word, but the same acceptance of the ways that technology should be dealt with?
It's all a mindset, right? You have to have the right attitude when you go into something. Otherwise, you're lost from the start. If you don't go into any job, whether it's maintaining your motorcycle or writing a report or fixing a door lock or going out on a date or whatever, if you don't go into it with the right attitude, you might as well not bother because you're wasting your time. And in this case, I found that, Pirsig was a very good motorcycle mechanic. He had a thorough understanding of engines. I mean, the man had an understanding of jet engines and of missile systems. He was a genius with an IQ of 170 or so. My own motorcycle maintenance is not on a par with his. I tend to get frustrated at things. I tend to use a hammer and an axe while fixing my motorcycle, while he never would do that. And it's usually through pressure of time. I have only so much time in which to get something done. Following this journey of Robert Pirsig's, I would have only so much time because I had to get to a certain point by the end of the day where Robert Pirsig, or very clear and very near to where the Pirsigs would have stayed. So I had the pressure of that I couldn't always take the time to do the job properly. However, more than often I could, and I found it very, very rewarding. What I really found rewarding was at the end of the whole trip, once I had completed it, I was free of the constraints of following this journey, free of the constraints of the Pirsigs. And I went off to Covelo, in fact. I have a friend who's lived there. I went to Covelo, California, and spent 3 days or so rebuilding my motorcycle and really doing the job properly. And I found that immensely satisfying, and it lasted me almost all the way home again.
You exchanged letters with Pirsig in the writing of this book. Did he approve of that whole rebuilding and doing it exactly right? I imagine that he would if you told him about it.
He didn't really. I mean, he wasn't that bothered by it. He didn't care for anybody to do this. He has answered lots of questions from Pirsig's pilgrims along the way. The first question I had for him, I think, was, what was your route home? Because I thought if I was going to follow this route, then maybe I should follow his route home. And he said, oh, well, actually, we went off to, the journey for us didn't stop in San Francisco. We went to visit a friend in Hollywood and then came back through Nebraska and Utah. And it was irrelevant for me to follow that particular route back. But I would write him some letters with some questions, and we maybe had exchanged a half a dozen letters. And his replies were always very brief, like, it doesn't really matter. This is what happened since you ask, but don't be too influenced by that. He read the first manuscript of my book, in which he was very rarely mentioned. As I say, when I went off on this journey, I had originally intended to just write a road trip story, a nice travelogue. During the actual road trip itself, it became more than that, a lot more than that. It became a story about my own midlife crisis, personal angst, resolution with my family, that sort of thing. But I got to the end of the trip, came home, thought, yes, I do have a book here, and I wrote this book. I wrote it over the winter of 2004, 2005, and I sent it to Robert Pirsig in the springtime, this manuscript, which I thought was wonderful. I thought it was a brilliant book. And I sent it to him, and he wrote back and said, I've read your book, and your journalism's very good, he said. I think he corrected a couple of dates or something. But he said, ultimately I got the same feeling from reading your manuscript as I get when I'm on an airplane, and there's a movie playing, and I'm not wearing any headphones. There's a whole soundtrack that's missing from your book. And because of that, it was a disappointment to me. I wish you luck in figuring out what it is. I couldn't tell you. Best regards, Robert Pirsig. That was it. And in fact, 2 or 3 weeks later, he wrote me another letter. It was unsolicited. He just sent this thing. He said, I've been thinking about your book, and I think that what may be missing is a thorough analysis of Zen. And you should spend some time studying Zen, and here's some books that you might read, and maybe go hang out at a Zen center, and maybe that should be in your book. And I thought, oh, great. I mean, it's going to take me 50 years to figure out that I don't understand the sound of one hand clapping. I read the books that he suggested, and they were wonderful books, but I didn't think that Zen was what was missing from my book, but nobody could tell me what was. In the end, in fact, I shelved my book. I hated my book, as he wrote a manuscript of Zen and the Art, and then threw it away and hated it for 3 months before starting afresh. I did the same thing for 1 year. I put it on the shelf for 1 calendar year and refused to look at it because I knew there was something wrong with it, but I couldn't figure out what it was. But it was during that calendar year that I gave it to a colleague and said, will you read this? And here's some money, so you have to write me a report, a little bit of money. Write me a page and tell me what's up with my book. And he read it, and he said, well, I enjoyed your book, but it's all right. But what's missing is Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I want to know more about the book itself that you have not gotten into, and I want to know a lot more about the kooky guy who wrote it. He said, it's the elephant in the room. You can't ignore it. So I pulled my book off the shelf at the end of the year, read it, realized it was really boring, and chipped away at the research, and the rest is history.
How much research did you have to do to get the information on Pirsig, Pirsig's family, Pirsig's history, and the writing of the original book to the point where you thought, hey, this is a pretty satisfactory amount of information I'm going to have in here? How much did that take?
Well, what I actually did here, Colin, was that I recognized that this manuscript number 1 needed what had been suggested. It needed the analysis of Zen and the Art, and it needed some biographical detail. Both of these were a challenge to me because, on the one side, while I had a perfectly comfortable understanding of Zen and the Art, It was my understanding of the book. And people have written PhD theses on this book. I didn't really like to impose my understanding of it on other people. I had taken the attitude that, hey, if you're interested in it, read it for yourself and get what you can out of it. Clearly that wasn't enough. And a primer, if you will, to Zen and the Art, a context to it, was what was required. So I read it again, and in fact I've read it probably, 20 times now. But I've written up what I believe to be, the primer to it, and the analysis of what it's all about. But then, as you say, there was the biographical detail, which, frankly, Robert Pirsig wasn't talking about. He had discussed his life and discussed some of the things about it with journalists in the past, but he'd only ever talked about what he wanted to talk about. What I did was I amassed as much of this information as I could from previously published sources. Robert Pirsig himself answered, a letter, or maybe there are 2 or 3 sort of small questions on this. And I wrote a second manuscript that had the analysis of the book and also had as much biographical detail as was publicly available. And I sent this to Robert Pirsig, and he wrote back and said, oh yeah, that's much better, now go away please. But during my research for this, and this was this was 6 months or so of fairly intensive, every day chipping away a bit here, there, and everywhere. During my research, I had actually tracked down some former family members and some friends, including what was most critical, which was Robert Pirsig's ex-wife, Nancy James, who is now living in Florida, and his estranged son, Ted, who was living in Hawaii. I actually found him in Switzerland. And I wrote to them separately, and I said, I have written this book, this manuscript. Please, may I send you the manuscript, and would you consider reading it and just telling me if I've written anything that's wrong? I don't want to write anything that's wrong. I'm a journalist, I wanted the truth here. And they both said, well, okay, we'll have a look at it. It's been a long time, we've sort of put these memories behind us, but we'll have a look at it. And they both read the book separately. Ted read it in 1 day flat. Flat on his back. He'd hurt himself in a rollerblading accident, so he didn't have anything else to do. Nancy took a little more time over it, and both of them independently came back to me and said, look, what you've written is correct. There's nothing, maybe this date was out or that spelling is wrong. But what you've written is there, but there's so much more to the story that you don't know. And since we can see where you're coming from with this book, we feel comfortable with being able to tell you that part of the story. And so then that was another few months of back and forth, asking lots of questions to fill in the gaps. And they filled in pretty much all of the gaps.
Now that I've heard that story of yours, I feel like that's a really good strategy. If you ever want information from people who can give you valuable information, just send them the manuscript, ask them if anything is wrong, and if they like it, they'll be forthcoming with extra information.
Yeah, but the problem there is that you have to write that initial manuscript knowing it's not the final manuscript. And knowing that this is just sort of notes, but doing as best of a job you can. In this case, I wrote up the manuscript thinking, well, maybe this is going to be the book. Maybe nobody will ever get back to me, so I have to write the best story that I can with all of its various literary devices and the like. If you go into this knowing that this is just an interim measure, then it's probably disheartening to actually sit there writing it, knowing that everything you're writing is merely to try to get other information rather than possibly being a part of the final product.
It can't be too different from writing the very rough draft someone might start with, though.
Well, exactly, yes. And there are elements of my published book, paragraphs here and chunks there, that are pretty much exactly as I had originally written them in the first version. But I would say that of that first version that I had, at least half of it is gone. And as somebody said, well, that's okay, use that in your next book.
It's got an homage to, of course, Pirsig's journey, but with the prose, I kept feeling like I was running across Pirsigian, let's say, turns of phrase. Was there?
Oh, you saw those, huh?
Oh, they were deliberate. That's what I'm asking. You deliberately made an homage to his style as well?
Yeah, this was my own little sort of tip of the hat to not only to Robert Pirsig, but to those Pirsigian scholars who do read his book extremely closely. And there are various phrases that I used in my own book, which there's only about a dozen or so of them, but it'll be a phrase or a word or a term that sticks out a little bit from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is just intended to be kind of like a little gem to be discovered by somebody. I actually made a list of them. I think I worked it out at being 12 or 13 at one point during one of the rewrites. But I described, for example, that I'm lying in the bed looking up at the gibbous moon. A gibbous moon is a moon it described it exactly at the time. But in Pirsig's story, at that same time, in that same place, he looks up at a gibbous moon, and it just sort of jumps out at you. I use his term about being a heretic who's recanted, for example, although in a completely different context. But that's one of those things that you'll notice if you know your Pirsig. What I think almost everybody will recognize is the lead of my book, which starts out, it was the only thing I knew when I set off to do this thing, that if there was a book, this would be the opening sentence of my book. And Robert Pirsig's book starts out with something like, I can tell from the watch on my wrist without even turning my head from the road that it's 8:30 in the morning. And my book starts out, I can tell from the sign on the billboard or the sign by the bank without even turning my head from the road that it's 9:30 in the morning. I want people to understand that I'm going to be writing a book here that is a little bit of a homage to Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. The tough part, of course, about it was that I wrote it in the same style, which is the first person present, which is, as I discovered, as Pirsig had discovered, and I discovered too, a very difficult thing to do, because you can't second guess yourself. Everything that when you write about something, you have to settle for what you thought of it at that time. And you can't say, actually, thinking about it, that was a dumb thing to do, because you haven't thought about it yet. You're in the present tense. Anyway, it was a challenge to do it, but everybody seems to think that I pulled it off.
Since Zen and the Art brought so many people toward Pirsig himself, and I know he found that somewhat unwelcome, I wanted to ask you, now that the book is obviously out and you're in the midst of publicity for it, what sort of people has Zen and Now brought you? What sort of stories have people come to you with?
Well, I've been giving various readings around the country as I've been on a road tour for this book. I had originally been supposed to fly in and out of a half a dozen airports or so, and I said, no, I want to take my motorbike. I did the West Coast and came through Santa Barbara, or just past Santa Barbara, on my Harley Davidson. She's a lot more comfortable than my dirt bike. But I'm now in New York City on my dirt bike because the Harley Davidson's in a truck somewhere coming back from Vancouver. And whenever I give a reading, I ask people, who here has read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance? Who read it all the way through, first time round, and who rides a motorcycle and all of that? And I had thought that the majority of people would be there because they like motorcycles, for the same reason as I originally went into this. But it became, for me, far, far more than that. And in fact, the motorcycling, I'd like to think that you can still read a nice road trip story out of my book, perhaps the story that you had hoped to read in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. But it's about a lot more than that. And I've actually been quite heartened that the majority of people who come to the readings and who talk to me afterwards are people who had read Zen and the Art, either recently or every year or 30 years ago, and it touched them in some way. And they were looking for a way that they could associate that with their current existence, and a way to bring that to modernize it with the state of affairs these days. And that the people who are enjoying my book are people who enjoyed Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
What do you think Robert Pirsig knows? What is the knowledge that people want so badly from him?
I think that what it is that he, as I mentioned, was a genius. Is a genius. The man has just turned 80 years old. He still lives in quiet seclusion in New England. He found that balance between the technology that he understood so well. He was a guy who wrote technological manuals. He wrote up the instruction manual for a guided missile system, for example. He knew how to put stuff together. But he also understood that there could be a beauty to things that wasn't always seen within technology. He gives the example of the Deweeses and Bozeman of assembling a rotisserie, saying, look, you don't have to follow the instructions directly that are on the piece of paper, because they're probably not the best instructions to be had. They're probably written by the guy with the most time on his hands. You don't have to build this rotisserie in this way. You can actually build it in a better way, and you can turn it into he's getting a little extreme here perhaps, but you can turn this rotisserie into a work of art, into a sculpture, into whatever you want it to be. I think that's a lesson that never goes away and that people these days are even more in need of.
The book, once again, is Zen and Now, on the Trail of Robert Pirsig and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Mark Richardson, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the program. It's
been my great pleasure. Thank you, Colin.
For more information on Mark Richardson and Zen and Now, visit zenandnow.org. Our music is produced by Ben Althouse. Hear more of his stuff at benalthouse.com. Find out more about the Marketplace of Ideas or visit our online show archive at colinmarshallradio.com.